60dB on podcast monetisation strategies, news from Chew TV and Patreon for podcasters.
Welcome to the Richard Daly Podcast, bringing you a UK perspective on the latest news and developments from the world of podcasting and internet radio.
Welcome to episode 25. I'm your host, Richard Daly. Each week I curate and discuss the latest news in podcasting and internet radio with a focus on the smaller podcaster, radio host and DJ. Let's start this week by looking at some thoughts on podcast monetisation strategies from Steve Henn of podcast discovery service 60dB. In episode 19 of the Pod to Pod podcast, published on the 13th of February this year, Matthew Passy spoke with Steve about his app and his view of the future of the podcasting ecosystem. It's well worth listening to the full 30-minute interview, link in the show notes, of course, at richarddaly.com/25. What I wanted to mention about this interview was the insight Steve has on monetisation. He starts by looking at the move of newspapers into digital over the last few years, where they threw away the previous subscription model of the delivered newspaper and started to rely on targeted advertising. So that happened, but the successful newspapers today are now operating freemium and subscription models as they found they couldn't survive on advertising revenue. 60dB wants to help podcasting move to similar models. He compares this to streaming music, where this same model is used. He also notes that adverts in streaming music aren't actually bringing in as much money as people think. Steve says it's less than the amount of revenue coming from vinyl sales. Steve favours models similar to Netflix and Pandora, and can't see subscriptions to individual podcasts or networks, like Gimlet, being successful. To make this work, you'll need a broad enough collection of podcasts to make it worth someone paying a subscription to avoid adverts. 60dB wants to create a marketplace that can be fair to podcasters in terms of revenue share. Steve concludes the interview by discussing the concept of 10-minute or shorter daily shows or stories, and he sees a big opportunity for podcasters who can produce these. This talks to something I've mentioned about a couple of times. More and more people seem to be talking about the benefits of shorter shows. Do listen to the full podcast, episode 19 of Pod to Pod, to hear the full discussion. I'm also happy to say that while researching this piece, I discovered that this podcast is also listed on 60dB, which is rather awesome, especially as I appear on the first page of results for the search term podcasting news. Nick Qua, in his newsletter this week, reports on a brief discussion on podcasts that happened at the Code Media conference this week. Rob Walsh on the Lipsin podcast, The Feed, also mentioned this on their latest episode. Now, Rob spotted a few basic errors in the interview, like who invented podcasting and which company makes cereal, but as Rob says, it's good to hear from someone high up in Apple who knows what podcasts are and is thinking about their future. Eddie Q is Apple's Senior Vice President of Internet Software and Services and reports directly to Apple CEO Tim Cook. Q talked about some of the inventive things they're working on and said that Apple is working on new features for podcasts. He was pressed to say whether Apple was going to get more involved in podcasts and whether they would do anything to improve analytics, perhaps providing the same kind of access to subscribers as Apple does in the magazine space. Unfortunately, Q declined to provide any more details. I guess it's a case of watch this space. The discussion on podcasts was very short, but the interview covers a wide range of subjects related to music and podcasts. If you want to listen to this, you can find the full interview on the Recode Replay podcast feed. I'll also put a link to the video in the show notes. As an aside, Nick makes a really interesting comment in his newsletter this week, which I think highlights just what a split is happening in podcasting. Nick says that the more he writes about the podcast industry, the more he feels like he's compelled to mimic trade coverage styles from the television industry. So things like who's working with who's associated with what show, and lots of rumours about what's happening in the podcasting world. Now, of course, Nick focuses on the professional side of podcasting, reporting on happenings in the media world and from the big podcast networks. He notes that production politics are increasing as the industry matures. I see this as another sign of a growing split between the big companies getting into podcasting and the independent podcasters. I mentioned this when looking at the British Podcast Awards last week. Hopefully I'll be wrong and we will continue to see lots of diversity and acknowledgement of all types of podcast producers. Congratulations to Nick, by the way, as he is going to be a Knight Visiting Nieman Fellow later this year. He says he's going to use the backing to develop a guide for newsrooms looking to create local podcast strategies. Sounds very interesting. Thomas Mancusi of Audio Boom wants us to stop thinking about downloads and focus on numbers of listens instead. In a guest article for Rain News, Thomas says that podcast sales terminology needs to be unified across buyers and sellers. Mancusi is the Vice President for Sales and Development at Audio Boom, one of the leading podcasting and on-demand audio platforms around. The premise of the article is that a number of terms are being used more and more in podcasting, and different people mean different things by them. The particular issue that Mancusi wants to overcome is ensuring podcasts and buying agencies mean the same thing when using these terms. Some of the terms mentioned in the article include: what is a pre-roll? Is a live read actually read live? Is mid-roll a live read or an ad-injected spot? Now, if this is a topic that interests you, then do check out the article on the Rain News website. The author makes a number of recommendations aimed at standardising the terms, but I'll focus on just his thoughts on downloads versus listens. Mancusi wants to put an end to the word download, saying that it's a reminder of, and I quote, the archaic days of delivering a podcast. He favours the use of the word listens instead. Now, his thinking on this is that more people are now clicking on the play button and listening immediately than used to be the case, and that the number of people downloading content is decreasing. Now, I accept there does seem to be a slow trend in this direction, which is probably helped by the availability of some podcasts on streaming services. Personally, I'm not sure this really matters, except that for me, the term listens implies that a whole show has been consumed. So how will you count it if someone quits before the end? Would that be half a listen or a quarter of a listen? Basically, don't expect measurement and the related analytics to get any simpler anytime soon. UK-based Chew TV continues to grow. Chew is a live streaming platform with a community of over 350,000 amateur up-and-coming and professional DJs and producers and personalities from over 130 countries. They also say they have an audience in over 190 countries around the world. This week, Chew report that they've passed a figure of over 1 million chat messages sent on the platform in the 2 years since launch, and that their community sent 150,000 messages in the month of January 2017 alone. Chew also say that their new features such as stream forwarding, including to Facebook and other live streaming platforms, are proving popular. They also offer Mixcloud and Dropbox integration, where the audio of DJ sets can be automatically posted once finished. One intriguing thing about Chew is that they are very open about the features they are planning or considering introducing. Now, last week on this podcast I mentioned Trello, and Chew actually provide open access to anyone to their Trello board that they use for feature development. I'll put a link in the show notes at richarddalley.com/25 if you'd like to take a look. Patreon is popular with both podcasters and online DJs as a way to gain financial support for their shows from their audiences. Simon Owens has written an article on Medium that explores the use of Patreon by various podcasts and discuss how successful this monetisation strategy has been for them. Many podcasts struggle to attract advertising despite having loyal and growing audiences, so they're looking at other ways to start generating revenue. Simon discusses several stats on advertising, including that some podcast companies report that they're commanding between $50 and $100 per 1,000 listeners. He also mentions a comment from Midroll Media, one of the leading podcast networks, which said that shows need to be getting 50,000 listens per episode to be accepted into the Midroll network, and they're looking to double this to 100,000. A common figure stated for shows to start being interesting for advertisers is 5,000 downloads per episode, and at least according to Rob Walsh of Lipsin, that would put your show in the top 10% or so of all podcasts being published. So you can see why many smaller podcasts turn to Patreon and seek the support of their existing audience. Patreon was founded by music artist Jack Conte and is a crowdfunding site optimised for artists who generate work on an ongoing basis. Instead of making a one-off contribution, supporters set a dollar amount, and then Patreon charges that amount to their credit card each month. Patreon also allows producers to set different subscriber levels with different rewards. As more and more podcasters have joined Patreon, the company has provided more tools and features, specifically for podcasters, including a special RSS feed that allows subscribers to listen to bonus content in the podcast app of their choice. Now, interestingly, Patreon is also being used by a number of bigger shows, some with hundreds of thousands of downloads. And these shows have found it as a great way to reward their loyal listeners and to bring in extra revenue. I'll finish this episode with something this week that I fear is going to become more common as the podcasting space grows and gets more crowded. Santa Fe-based Mariah Media Network publishes Outside magazine and has other ventures around that name. And in March 2016, it published its first Outside podcast. Unfortunately for Mariah Media, New Hampshire Public Radio has been producing an Outside/In podcast since November 2015 and started a radio show of the same name in April 2016. New Hampshire has now gone to a US federal court to defend its right to create the Outside/In podcasts. It seems that they've done this because they're worried that Outside magazine is preparing to sue, even though the magazine actually gave the Outside/In podcast its own award as Best Podcast of 2016. Mariah apparently asked New Hampshire to stop infringing on its claimed trademark of Outside, and the lawsuit is the response. The case is still ongoing, but I think it should serve as a warning to all podcasters to think carefully about the name of their show and brand when getting started, to avoid the possibility of expensive legal fees. Okay, so that's all the news from the Richard Daly podcast for this week. If you visit my website at richarddaly.com, you will find all my social media links, as well as the various ways you can subscribe to the show. The show notes for this episode are at richarddaly.com/25. As usual, please send me your questions or comments, and if there is a topic you'd like me to cover, then tweet me. As always, I really appreciate your feedback. If you are enjoying the podcast, I'd be delighted if you'd leave me a rating and review at iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.